Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you and thank you for participating in Paideia Connections, engaging in scholarly conversations. I'm Ben Pierce. I teach in the biology department here. Paideia Connections is one of my favorite events at Southwestern University. I think it really represents what is unique and special about the Southwestern experience. For Paideia Connections, we asked two of our outstanding faculty members to each give an engaging presentation, about 20 minutes, on their scholarship. And then we asked you, the audience, to participate by talking about the connections that you see between these two very different areas of scholarship. Our distinguished speakers this fall are Dr. Elaine Craddock from the Department of Religion and Dr. Emily Niemeyer from the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry. Each of them will be introduced by a current or former student who has directly benefited from their extraordinary teaching and scholarship. Before we begin, I need to tell you that the presentations and the audience discussion following the presentations will be videotaped, and we'll put these on the Southwestern University webpage. So if you do not want to be videotaped, please do not stand up and talk at the end of the presentations. And please remember to silence your cell phones during the presentation. So at this time, I would like to ask Julia McDonald, one of our current students, to come and to introduce Dr. Craddock.
Hi, my name is Julia McDonald, and I am a junior religion major here, and I have the honor of introducing one of my favorite professors here at Southwestern, Dr. Craddock. I first met Dr. Craddock in the summer of 2014 at Sprague Day. For those of you who may not know, Sprague Day is when new admitted students go to Southwestern to sign up for classes, get their pirate cards, and take their first steps toward becoming a pirate. Dr. Craddock was assigned to me as my temporary advisor in order to help me choose my classes. This assigned advisor that students are given for Sprague Day doesn't always become their academic advisor, but after meeting Dr. Craddock, I was absolutely set on keeping her. Since then, I've taken 2 of her classes, and I'm taking a 3rd one this semester. Dr. Craddock has an incredible ability to encourage students to think critically and deeply about course topics. When I took Intro to Hinduism with her in my first year, she inspired me and enhanced my passion for world religions. She taught me about how religion spans across geographical, social, and cultural spaces. Her research in India, some of which has been published in her book, Shiva's Demon Devotee, provides personal background to the stories and topics she discusses in class. It's one thing to read about the deities and religious communities of Hinduism in India, but to discuss it with someone who not only studies India, but is full of passion and unquenchable curiosity is an incredible privilege. Through her, I've heard stories about the Hindu tirthas of India and the sacred spaces within temples. I've debated about what religion really is and how to define it, an exercise that religion majors are all too familiar with. I've learned about gender identity through the lens of religion. I've seen the incredible discipline of religious ascetics, and I've applied these lessons to my own life in ways that are unbelievably rewarding. Dr. Craddock always encourages me to think more critically and more deeply about every aspect of religion, and she never settles for less than my best. I've known her for over 2 years, and she can tell when I'm not putting forth my best effort. And let me tell y'all, there's nothing scarier than the look she gives me when she knows I've been slacking off. But every time I think I've come close to learning everything there is about gender, sexuality, or religion, she finds a way to astound and inspire me all over again, as I'm sure she will inspire you all today.
Thank you. Am I on, Paul? Yeah? Thank you, Julia. That was beautiful. So I guess if I just do this, oh, there we go. Thank you, Julia. That was wonderful. You get an A. Thanks to Ben for all the organizing, and to Paul Sicard for setting all this up, and for Sue Smith for all the work she's done. In the U.S. today, some of the hottest topics being debated concern the lives of transgender people. I think it seems as if we sometimes think that issues like these pertain only in societies like our own. So it's been fascinating for me to learn that transgender people have been a force in India for hundreds of years. Part of my fascination is the paradox that on the one hand, they have active roles in temples and are revered for their work with religious ritual, at the same time that they are discriminated against and even despised for not being like everybody else. I've been doing research in India for more than 2 decades. I work specifically, if I can get the mouse to work, in the southeastern state of Tamil Nadu. I've been working on this particular project for the last several years, for which I have done some work in the state capital of Chennai, the 4th largest city in India. But I've actually done more work in some of the interior regions, spanning from smaller cities to towns to villages. I use the word transgender in my title because that's a word that has become globally known. It is known and used in India. But since male to female transgender people have been identified and written about for hundreds of years in India, there are many terms in the many languages that are spoken in India. The most common in India, known throughout India, is the word hijra. So that's the word I'm going to be using in my talk today. From the beginning of this project, I've been working with my research assistant, Davamani. I speak Tamil, the language spoken in the state, but not well enough to negotiate all the contexts I find myself in research, so he can translate with me. In addition, I'm only able to be in the field intermittently. The most recent was this spring when I was awarded a sabbatical and I was able to spend a good chunk of time over there, but he lives there. He's maintained ties with members of the Hijra community. He is invited to and attends events when I'm not there, so he's been able to gather data when I'm not with him, which has greatly enriched our project. He's sitting here next to Bharati, a Hijra leader we have interviewed many times over the years and gotten to know fairly well. You will see many photographs of Bharati here. Most of the photographs are mine, some are Davamani's, and I pulled a couple of images off of media websites. I'm going to focus on 2 themes in my talk today. The first one is visibility. The last few years, Hijras have become much more visible in a variety of arenas, a variety of media, a variety of ways. This visibility can have very positive effects. It can educate people, raise awareness about this community of people so they're seen simply as members of the broader society. But it can also be negative when it frames people as an entertainment spectacle. The second theme is mainstreaming. Over the last few years, some government reforms have been implemented that have the aim of more fully integrating Hijras into the mainstream society. That also has had some positive effects. But the process also raises a couple of questions. Who continues to be excluded? And what aspects of Hijra community that could potentially enrich the broader community are being lost? Hijras are blessed by the goddess. They identify very closely with Ardhanarishvara, we see here, who is the god Shiva on the, the god Shiva on the left and the goddess Shakti on the right. This is a figure that encapsulates some very important Hindu concepts, but the male-female embodiment is one that Hijras identify very closely with. Hijras all over India are united by their worship of the goddess Bahuchara Mata. Mata means mother. She is worshipped at all the most important ceremonies in Hijra community. We see here an altar laid out to her. This is on the occasion of a Hijra deciding to sacrifice the male genitalia. It is through this sacrifice of the male genitalia that Hijras gain power from the goddess, a special connection to her. They are empowered to bless other people, perform rituals at goddess temples. This is also a physical transformation that secures a higher status for them in Hijra community. Traditionally, Hijras have gone to a Hijra called a Dayama for this surgery. We see here the Dayama Suganya, who recently celebrated her 100th surgery. So Hijras continue to go to Dayamas, but increasingly over the last few years, Hijras have gone to medical doctors for the procedure. 40 days after the surgery is a very joyous ceremony welcoming the newly transformed Hijra into the community. Here we see Sheetal, who's at a point in the ritual where she's about to take off the veil and worship Bahuchara Mata face to face in her newly transformed body for the first time. These ceremonies are celebrated in large Hijra gatherings. Hijras come from all over the state to support each other to celebrate. Here they're passing around a tray to gather gifts for Sheetal, the celebrant. Bahuchara Mata is a goddess located in the far northwestern state of Gujarat. She is not a Tamil goddess. She does not have a temple in Tamil Nadu. So Tamil Hijras are connected to local goddesses, and they perform rituals at temples in Tamil Nadu. So here we see Kirtana performing a ritual for 2 men at a big temple to the very popular goddess Angala Parameshwari. It was actually at goddess temples where I've done a lot of work over the last couple of decades where I first became acquainted with Hijras and noticed that non-Hijras, like these 2 men, often sought out their services over non-Hijra ritual specialists because they were seen as more powerful, more efficacious in their lives. Some Hijras have their own temples. Here we see Sinu performing rituals at her temple. She is a particularly innovative ritual specialist that has been drawing larger and larger crowds to her temple, which is in a very remote village over the last few years. Many Hijras have temples to the goddess Kali, who is more widely known in India and I think outside of India. We see here Janani at her temple to Kali. You see it's a simple structure. But sometimes when the goddess, the Hijra specialist, gets a growing reputation for the power, the efficacy of this particular temple, this goddess, this specialist, that more and more devotees come, more donations flow in, and they are able, if they want to build elaborate, larger, more elaborate temples to accommodate more devotees. We see that's what's happened with Ganga on the left, who has a Kali temple in the large city of Vellore in the north of the state. And Sintal on the right, who has a popular Kali temple in a very tiny village called Vimatur in the central coastal area. But Hijras are also cursed by men. Virtually every Hijra we've interviewed said that although they were born in what was perceived to be a boy's body, they always knew they were girls. So this mismatch between their inner sense of self and how others see them grows more and more critical and really reaches a crisis point when they hit puberty, at which point they're supposed to be growing into young men, but others see them as instead becoming more feminine. They are the victims of a lot of bullying, a great deal of violence, including sexual violence. Many of them drop out of school at this point. Low educational levels is endemic to the community. In addition, when a son tells the family that he is in fact a daughter, many, if not most families, kick them out of the house, saying if they kept them in the house, they would bring shame to the entire family. In India, your identity is based on your family. Without a family, you really don't have a place in society. So Hijras have replaced the families they've lost with their own kinship network. It is a web of relations not based on marriage and reproduction and bloodlines, but on female kin. There's a vertical axis of mothers, grandmothers, great-grandmothers, daughters, granddaughters, a horizontal axis of sisters and cousins. These are relationships formed by choice. We see here Sangeeta has chosen to be the daughter to Bharati, the mother or the guru. Bharati has a household of daughters. They live together as a family. They pool resources. Hijra families are very common in Hijra communities all over India. But there is a range of participation in the Hijra community. Most Hijras choose to become a daughter to a mother because it anchors their identity in Hijra community. But many do not choose to live in a Hijra household. Some may even pass as male in the public sphere and interact in Hijra community in a much more limited way. One of the most, these relationships are formalized at Hijra gatherings. One of the most famous, or important to me and fascinating parts of Hijra kinship is that every Hijra will adamantly and proudly declare there is no caste, class, or religion in Hijra community. In India, it is highly unusual for an entire community to have this policy. These relationships are maintained partly by traveling to ceremonies and events, celebrating each other, supporting each other. It can be time-consuming depending on how far you have to travel in the state. In addition, these ceremonies tend to go on all night. So Hijras have a culture, a sense of time that really grinds against the 9 to 5 business time that dominates the public sphere. Dancing is integral to all Hijra ceremonies, and I had to throw in one slide of dancing because it's a lot of fun, and they do a lot of it, so it's great. So, if Hijras are so discriminated against, how do they make a living? In some parts of India, they are called on to bless newlywed couples' newborn babies, but in Tamil Nadu, that's never been a tradition. So most of them are forced into begging and prostitution, which is legal in India. In the 1980s, when it was discovered that HIV/AIDS had spread to India, non-governmental organizations, NGOs, as well as government organizations started channeling funds to prostitutes in India, including some funds particularly for Hijras. This was extremely important in the beginning. Of course, people didn't know what this was, and they were dying. But you see here, this is an event organized by many different organizations, particularly the middle three, which are focused specifically on HIV/AIDS. But now that we're 3 decades into the epidemic, many Hijras express really deep frustration that the organizations continue with their narrow focus on disease, which has the effect of stigmatizing them as disease bodies that need to be contained and are not spreading the resources and helping along many other aspects of Hijra welfare that arguably are more important today. So Hijras themselves, over the last few years, have been very vociferous protesters on their behalf, demanding reforms from the government. And we see here again, Bharati, this is just one example of the activism they've been engaged in. She's petitioning local officials to issue an identification card with the option of a Hijra identity. Much as in the US, without an ID card in India, you really have no legal personhood. So you can't apply for a job, register to vote, receive food rations. So this was crucial. So the governments have responded to all of this Hijra activism. The government of India in 2014 recognized a third gender. Last fall, when I applied for a visa to go to India, on the application, you could be either male, female, or transgender. But the state of Tamil Nadu has been more progressive than any other state or India. It recognized a third gender in 2008. It has set up a welfare board. It has a day of celebration. It gives some land, educational seats, and scholarships to Hijras. And in addition, will pay for surgery at government hospitals. The recognition of a third gender means that the ID cards have been distributed quite widely, which has had a real measurable benefit, material benefit for Hijras. They can now access resources that the broader public has long had access to. In addition, the government reforms have allowed at least some of the Hijras who have managed to complete school to apply for and receive government jobs. Here, Jaya is being honored for becoming the director of the government school lunch program in a primary school. Priyadarshini is here being honored for becoming the first transgender police officer, which is both deeply ironic and extremely important, as police officers are some of the main perpetrators of violence against Hijras. Gomati, on the right, who lives in Chennai, has for the last few years been asked to come help train new police recruits, specifically to raise awareness about Hijra lives and Hijra community. Most of the Hijras we've interviewed the last couple of years have said that violence against them from police officers as well as men in the broader society has been reduced, and that is an extremely important change. In addition, Hijras have increasingly been more able to start and fund self-help community-based organizations on their own. Shweta, on the left, is the founder of the Born to Win Social Welfare Trust. She generates funds in a variety of ways, one of which is publishing and selling a calendar that's highlighting accomplished Hijras. We see here the news anchor Padmini Prakash, who is Ms. April. This is Jiva, the managing director of the Transgender Rights Association, which has been able to address many aspects of Hijra welfare quite successfully. These are just 2 examples of organizations that are started by, managed by, staffed by, and focused on Hijras. Part of the focus on Hijra welfare includes giving programs to raise awareness in the broader society. So this spring I was able to attend the sensitization meeting for village leaders in the smaller city of Sinji. Salima is the managing director of this organization, and part of her program that day was demonstrating how people respond to children who come out to them as hijras. On the left, this panel rejected the child, which of course is devastating to that young person. The panel on the left modeled how you could support the child and keep them in the family with respect. Many hijras told us that it would have helped them a lot if they'd been able to live at home for a little bit longer. But they also said they would then have to follow the caste and religion rules of that household. Just this month, a city used public funds to build a separate bathroom for hijras at a bus station. This is a recognition that bathrooms are a site of a great deal of violence inflicted on transgender people. And increasingly, hijras are writing their own stories in their own words. Some of them have been translated into English and are available in places like Amazon. The Kuvakam Festival has become very closely identified with hijras, a site of hijra gathering in the last few years. Kuvakam is a very small village, but it has a well-known temple to the god Aravan, who we see here. Aravan is a figure from the great Indian epic, the Mahabharata, which narrates a very bloody 18-day war between two factions of a family over who's going to inherit the kingdom. They've had a multi-day, very elaborate festival connected to the Mahabharata for at least 150 years that drew people from all over. It has not historically been connected to hijras. So this is a recent day, a recent change. Hijras come specifically for 2 days of the festival, the days celebrating the marriage and the sacrifice of Aravan. Aravan has agreed to sacrifice himself on the battlefield in order to end the war, but he requests that the night before he be allowed to marry and no sexual love. But nobody's going to marry somebody who's going to die the next day. So the god Krishna incarnates as the beautiful Mohini. Hijras identify very closely with Mohini. They see themselves as the true brides of Aravan because of all the suffering they've had to endure in their lives. Only they have generated the strength and resilience to be able to marry and then immediately become widows. So on the marriage day, we see here priests tying the tali. This is the marriage necklace, a symbol of marriage in Tamil culture for particularly hijras. This is a really happy day. Hijras come from all over the state, all over India, even all over the world to celebrate. Very joyful day. The next day, they go to the lamentation ground where they cut their tali, they break their glass bangles. These are the things that women do when they become widows. This is the end of this part of the festival, and they disperse. So increasingly, hijras have talked about this festival as a hijra festival. They have become a powerful contingent at the festival. The temple has responded in ways like giving them their own entrance to the temple during the festival. Non-hijras also identify this festival with hijras. We see these guys with their phones out taking pictures of only the hijra participants. The media coverage of this festival has just exploded over the last few years from press, just stories about the festival, but commercial films have been made of it. There are many clips on YouTube, and many of them actually say Transgender Festival or Hijra Festival, interestingly. I asked this guy what press he was from, and he said, "Oh, I'm not a journalist. I'm just an amateur photographer from Bangalore, which is in another state, but I heard this was a great place to practice your skills." Connected to the festival is a beauty pageant called Miss Kuvakam. India has a very vibrant beauty pageant industry, so it makes cultural sense to use a pageant as an arena to showcase the talents, the accomplishments, and the physical beauty of hijras. This was originally started by NGOs, but in the last few years has been taken over by hijra leaders themselves, and this is who we see on this poster. This is a picture from a few years ago, as a pretty low-key, small, amateurish affair. You see it's a small hall, small stage. But over the last few years, along with the festival, it has become extremely popular. So this year, we really were not even able to squeeze into the hall. It was so crowded. But in front of the venue, hijras were posing for photographs, but they were also giving interviews to the press. So increasingly, they are shaping their own image in their own words. So finally, hijras have always had to balance two worlds. But with the recent government reforms, is the boundary between the two worlds shifting. In some ways, it may be shifting towards Hijra community. As that community's profile becomes higher, some Hijras who are more closeted may feel more comfortable taking part in Hijra community. But the boundary may also be shifting more towards the mainstream side of society. There have already been some positive gains. The reduced violence is extremely important in the everyday lives of Hijras. Some Hijras have had more educational and job opportunities, and some are moving away from prostitution, knowing that that's one of the things that stigmatizes them. The government resources are significant in symbolic terms, but are fairly minimal in material terms. For most Hijras, assuming their authentic embodiment and identity, becoming who they want to be, is paramount. And for many, if not most, this involves surgery. The demand exceeds what's available in government hospitals, so they must go elsewhere. It's a very expensive surgery. So many of them remain in prostitution, which is much more lucrative than what they can do in jobs in the public sphere. And some Hijras are also pushing back against what is required to become socially acceptable. They have a unique identity. Hijra community has its own culture and sense of time. Adapting to the normalizing demands of the public sphere may simply take away too much. So at this point, I think that rather than shifting, the boundary between the two worlds is getting more porous. Thank you.
Hello, thank you, Dr. Craddock. My name is Katie McCants. I'm a 2015 graduate of Southwestern, and I currently serve as the program coordinator for the Howard Hughes Medical Institute grant here. I'm very honored to introduce our next faculty speaker, Dr. Emily Niemeyer. She completed her undergraduate studies in chemistry at Ohio Northern University, and after receiving her PhD in analytical chemistry from State University of New York at Buffalo, Dr. Niemeyer immediately began teaching here in 1998. Her dedication to research and teaching are evident through her many accomplishments and her continued leadership here. She has been awarded with almost $2.5 million in research and teaching grants since 1996, including the $1.3 million HHMI grant that has completely transformed Southwestern's science and math program since 2012. She helped found Southwestern's Environmental Studies program, and she also holds the prestigious Herbert and Kate Dishman Chair in Science. Dr. Niemeyer has been recognized with numerous awards, including an Exemplary Teaching Award and an Outstanding Texas Women in STEM Award, and rightfully so, because everyone who knows her knows just how committed she is to innovative teaching, and most importantly, in my opinion, how caring and supportive she is toward her students. And I would know because I was one of her students. I came to Southwestern as a biology major who wanted to attend medical school, but halfway into college, my interests shifted, and I joined Dr. Niemeyer's lab to start conducting analytical chemistry research studying the antioxidant properties of purple basil, which you'll hear about in just a minute. Dr. Niemeyer has been the most supportive and inspiring mentor through our research pursuits, and she's pushed me toward a level of scholarship and scientific inquiry that's beyond what I imagined I could achieve in my time as a student and as a recent graduate. After working with her for over 3 years now, I'm very excited to celebrate her accomplishments with you tonight. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Emily Niemeyer.
Thank you so much, Katie. And I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to talk with you today about my research. Oh, yes, which is on factors that affect the production of antioxidants in plants. So I want to start by actually giving you a brief overview of my talk today. So I'm going to provide you first with some background information about free radicals and oxidative stress. And I'll then talk a little bit about antioxidants and their effects on human health, as well as some dietary sources of antioxidants. I'm then going to talk to you a little bit about my research goals over the past several years, as well as the plant system that we've been studying. I'll then focus on a specific project and tell you about the experimental design, as well as the methods that we used for that project. And I'll go over some results, talk about what we can conclude from those results, and finish up with some acknowledgments. So I want to start by introducing you to the concept of free radicals and reactive oxygen species. So free radicals are actually molecular species that have an unpaired electron. And so because of that, they're highly reactive and they're very unstable. Now, reactive oxygen species are specific types of free radicals that contain oxygen. So they would be species such as those that are shown here, the hydroxyl radical, which has this little red unpaired electron, as well as the superoxide anion radical, which also you'll notice has an unpaired electron. Now, these types of species, like free radicals and reactive oxygen species, are produced in the human body during our normal metabolic processes, and they can have positive roles in some processes, such as energy production, but they can also damage our cells and our tissues, as well as our DNA. So along with being produced in the body, we're also continually exposed to external sources, which end up leading to free radical production. And so those could be things like ultraviolet light, high saturated fat diets, or chemical pollutants. So what happens when these free radicals and these reactive oxygen species interact with our cells and tissues is they end up causing what's known as oxidative damage. And the degree of that damage continues to increase as we age. And this oxidative damage and the aging process is associated with a variety of illnesses, things like cardiovascular disease and some forms of cancer. So there can also become a situation where if we're exposed to enough free radicals and our body is unable to defend against them, where the balance actually tips and we enter a situation that's called oxidative stress, which is also associated with various diseases. And so you may ask, how do we deal with these antioxidants that are being generated, or these free radicals that are being generated in our body all the time? And the way that we deal with them is an antioxidant system. And antioxidants are actually chemicals that can donate electrons to free radicals, and they therefore reduce their capacity in order to cause damage. So the human body has an antioxidant system. And the antioxidant system in the human body reacts by a number of different types of mechanisms. And the antioxidants that are present in our body have a lot of different roles depending on where they're located. There can be multiple forms of antioxidants. Some of them are enzymes, and others are peptides or even hormones. But the problem is that our body actually doesn't produce enough antioxidants in order to interact with all of the free radicals that we're exposed to on a daily basis. And so for that reason, it's important as humans that we also intake antioxidants within our diets. So the role of these dietary antioxidants is then to supplement our natural antioxidant system. And so shown here is an example of an antioxidant. So this is vitamin E. It's a fat-soluble antioxidant that we take into our bodies and our diets when we eat things like almonds or kale or chard. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about some of these dietary sources of antioxidants. So scientists have known for a long time that people that eat diets that are rich in fruits and vegetables and other plant foods tend to have lower instances of certain diseases, and those are most often certain forms of cancer, but also cardiovascular disease. And so we know there are lots of things in plants that lead to their health benefits. Plants contain fiber, and they have vitamins and minerals, but plants also contain a series of compounds which are known as phenolics or polyphenolics. Now, plants produce these things as metabolites, and they have a variety of different functions. So when the plant actually makes phenolic compounds, they may make a phenolic in order to lend a bitter taste to the plant so that an insect doesn't eat it. They may make a phenolic in order to make the plant brightly colored, so a pollinator comes and visits the plant. Or they may be responding to a stressful situation, and the plant will make a phenolic in order to protect it against drought or heat. So there are lots of different structures. There are literally thousands of these phenolic compounds that are produced by plants over the span of their lifetimes. And why they're important to us is because plant phenolics are the primary source of antioxidants within our diets. So Shown here is a plant phenolic. This is called quercetin. And quercetin is actually synthesized by pomegranate. So if you eat Edie's antioxidant fruit bars, you're getting quercetin. But quercetin is also made by many other plants. So if you drink green or black tea, or if you happen to like avocados, then you're also getting quercetin in your diet. So over the past 9 years, my research goal has been to understand some simple methodologies that can be used to increase antioxidant levels in plants. So scientists know that antioxidants are beneficial when we eat them. So we were thinking about some maybe simple methods that we can use to make plant foods more healthy. So scientists also know, if you look in the literature, that there are some methods that will affect antioxidant levels. These would be things like the actual genetics of the plant. Could also be applying plant hormones. These are known as elicitors. Growing conditions can affect antioxidant levels in plants. So these could be things like exposing the plant to ultraviolet radiation, or maybe the type of climate that the plant is grown in. And it can also be things like the nutrition or the fertilization that's delivered to the plant while it's growing. And finally, the harvest date can also affect antioxidant levels in plants. And so what we're thinking about here, and as you can imagine, if we know the factors that can affect antioxidant levels and we can control for them, then we really have the opportunity to actually cause a plant to have its maximum level of antioxidants and health benefits at the time when we harvest it and then later eat it. So the plant system that we've been studying over the past 9 years or so has been the Lamiaceae family of herbs. So the Lamiaceae family is a series of aromatic flowering plants, and it's composed of both culinary as well as medicinal herbs. So many of these are herbs that you're familiar with, things like basil and rosemary, oregano, and thyme. You see some pictures of those down below. But Lamiaceae actually contains over 7,000 individual species, so it is indeed a large family. It's globally distributed, and part of the reason that Lamiaceae families are found around the world is because they're easy to cultivate as well as propagate. Many of the Lamiaceae herbs are edible, and many of them are also ornamental and attractive to look at. So I want to provide you with an overview of some of the types of research studies that I've been working on with my students over the past 9 years. So we have looked at the effect of genetics on antioxidant levels, and one of the main ways we've done that is studying what is known as the cultivar, or the variety of these different Lamiaceae herbs. So we've looked at this in both purple as well as green basil. We've also studied a Lamiaceae plant which is known as lemon balm, and most recently we're actually looking at how antioxidant levels vary across a wide range of Lamiaceae plants. So we've also studied how plant nutrition can affect the Lamiaceae herbs basil and lemon balm. And we've also looked at how plant maturity or harvest date affects antioxidant levels, both in purple and green basil. And it's actually this study that Katie McCants completed for her honors project in 2015 that I'm going to be talking to you about today, and the effects of plant development on antioxidant levels in purple basil. So one thing you'll notice, my research here at Southwestern involves students. So a lot of these students have already graduated, and most of them use this research as part of their chemistry capstone projects. Most of them presented this research at national scientific conferences, and from these students, we've had 5 peer-reviewed publications on this work over the past several years. So I want to tell you a little bit more about basil, or Ocimum basilicum lamiaceae. So basil has a long history of cultivation. It was actually known by the ancient Greeks as the royal herb, and it has lots of different uses. So in the United States, basil is actually one of the top 3 most consumed herbs, along with oregano and sage. It also has traditional medicinal values for the treatment of things like stomach aches and fever, and also colds. You may not know that basil actually has some religious uses. So in some Eastern religion traditions, it's actually used in the preparation of holy water. It's commercially grown in greenhouses. It's an economically important herb, and it's globally distributed. So people use it around the world. So one of the things that we're really interested in with basil is it has antioxidant properties along with antibacterial, antimicrobial, anti-carcinogenic, anti-inflammatory. It has lots of medicinal capabilities. And the reason for that is it displays a high level of phenolic compounds. So if you remember, it's those phenolic compounds that really give it its high antioxidant capacity. But one of the most attractive things for us about basil, most of the research that I do with students happens in the summertime, and nearly every plant you try to grow in Central Texas in the summer dies, except basil. It loves it. It originated, they think, in the Mediterranean or maybe in Africa, but it loves warm and sunny conditions, and it just grows like crazy in Texas. So the system that I'm actually going to be talking to you about today, and Katie's research was based on purple basil. So you may not know that basil actually has a large variety of cultivars or varieties that are purple. And purple basil is actually pretty special because, like green basil, it has these high levels of phenolic compounds, specifically some phenolic acids that are known to have really high antioxidant capacity, so things like rosmarinic, chicoraic, and caphtoric acids. But along with that, it has these compounds which are known as anthocyanins. So anthocyanins are actually, here's a structure of one shown here, it's kind of a generic anthocyanin. Anthocyanins are the compounds that are responsible for red-blue pigmentation in plants. And so they are actually the compounds that lend purple basil its color. Now, plants make them for lots of different reasons, for protective and defensive roles, but they're important to us because they actually have very strong antioxidant properties. And they're interesting because there have been some recent studies, if you've heard about cranberry extracts or blueberry extracts being good for your health, it's the anthocyanins that actually lend that protective effect. They've been associated with a reduction of some neurological disorders such as Parkinson's disease. So let me tell you a little bit about what we've learned about basil in our research so far. So let me first tell you, one of the things that we've learned about basil is that it's actually more complicated than you might think it would be. So we started out by studying soil nutrition and how it affected basil's antioxidant levels. So as you know, plants need both micro and macronutrients in order to grow and survive. And so what we started doing is looking at how some main macronutrients, nitrogen and potassium, affected basil's ability to express antioxidants. So we apply these macro and micronutrients through the soil, and then basil takes them up through its roots. And so we started out with nitrogen, and one of the things we found that was really interesting is the more nitrogen we delivered to these basil plants, the less antioxidants they produced. And so we said, all right, so obviously basil is not a plant that likes to be fertilized, so, but we're gonna look at another plant nutrient. And so we then studied potassium, and we found out when we delivered a lot of potassium to basil, the exact opposite effect occurred. And instead, we saw that basil produced very high antioxidant levels when we had high levels of potassium fertilization. So at that point, we were beginning to study some different varieties of basil. So we conducted a large study of some different cultivars or varieties of basil. And what we found, we studied a number of green varieties of basil, and we found these two species, spice and jicafur, had very high levels of antioxidant activity. And the reason for that was they expressed very high levels of phenolic compounds. So we then decided to start looking at some purple varieties of basil. And so we studied some basil varieties such as rosy basil and Osman basil, which are some very common purple cultivars. And we found that it was a lot more complicated. So the phenolic acids that were important in green basil were also important in the purple varieties, but these anthocyanins, the purple pigments, also contributed to the antioxidant properties. So it was much harder to make predictions about what factors might affect the antioxidant levels in basil. So I want to talk to you a little bit now with all that background about the actual experiment that Katie did and some of the results that we got from that experiment. So we actually grew 3 cultivars of basil, which are shown here, sweet petra dark red, rosy, and purple ruffles. And so you'll see these look different from one another. So they have some what we call morphological differences. And after we grew those cultivars of basil, we harvested them at some unique dates. So we wanted to examine how the development of the plant affected the antioxidant levels. And so we started harvesting the seedlings at 9 days after germination, and then we essentially harvested them weekly at 9, 16, 23, 35, and 49 days after germination. So germination is actually when the seedling sprouts from the soil. So I'm an analytical chemist by training, as Katie said. So we then, once we harvest the basil, we collect a lot of different analytical tests, and I'll be talking to you about a few of these. So we look at the total phenolic levels. So phenolic levels are important because, as I said at the beginning, the amount of phenolics that are present in the basil correlates directly with the antioxidants that are present or the antioxidant activity. So we look at total phenolic levels, and we also analyze the individual phenolics that are present. So we look at the 6 most common basal phenolic acids, including some of these really good radical scavengers, rosmarinic and chicoraic acid. So we also do some assays to measure how well our basil can scavenge free radicals. So these are antioxidant capacity assays. And then for these purple varieties of basil, we actually quantify the amount of anthocyanins, or those purple pigments that are present, and we look at both the total amount of anthocyanins that are present in the leaves, and we also quantify the individual anthocyanins. And so you'll notice that the names for these are 1, 2, 3, and 4, and that's because if I actually put their names on there, it would take up the entire slide. Anthocyanins are very complicated, and so we denote them numerically to save the mouthful of the individual names. So a little bit more about our experimental methods. So we actually grew these plants in the Southwestern University greenhouse. We start them from seed, and we grow replicates for each one of the cultivars, as well as each of those unique harvest dates. And so we had a total of 66 plants that Katie was analyzing. And what we do is, even though basil, is an entire plant, we just analyze the leaves. That's the most important part. It's mostly what people eat. So what we do is we harvest those leaves, and then we store them at minus 80 degrees C until we can actually analyze them. So the way that we analyze them, as you see here, is that we grind that leaf tissue in liquid nitrogen until it's a fine powder, and then we take a liquid solvent and we extract the phenolic compounds that we're interested in analyzing out into a liquid solvent. It's just easier to analyze liquids. And then we take those samples, and we do a variety of different instrumental analytical techniques. We do some spectrophotometric assays, as well as some chromatographic and mass spectrometric methods. And finally, we do a lot of statistical analyses in order to identify any patterns within our data. So we're finally ready to look at some results here. So this graph actually shows on the y-axis here, you'll see the total phenolic content as a function of plant maturity. So plant maturity here is denoted as the days after germination, or DAG, at 9, 16, 23, 35, and 49 days after germination for each one of the different cultivars that we studied, purple ruffles and rosy and sweet petra dark red. So one of the things that you'll notice here is that at 9 days after germination, these basil plants don't express very many phenolic compounds, right? And again, we're interested in these phenolic compounds because they're really what are going to lend basil its antioxidant types of properties. Now, one of the other things which is very apparent here is that at 35 days after germination, we see a significant increase in the phenolic levels of our basil. So we also compared anthocyanin levels, and anthocyanin is in purple here to remind you that those are the red-blue pigments that we find, and they're the ones that give basil its purple color. So this is the total anthocyanin concentration as a function of plant maturity. The data is a little harder to see here, but at 9 days after germination, we do have the lowest anthocyanin levels, and we found that the highest anthocyanin levels, again, were at this 35 days after germination. So again, that's about 5 weeks after the seedling emerges from the soil. So we asked ourselves, what is going on at 35 days after germination that might end up leading to this big increase in the phenolic levels and the anthocyanin levels within our basil? So what we did is we looked at how our basil might be growing. And this graph here shows the average growth rate of our basil as a function of plant maturity, expressed in 2 different ways. So the black line shows the height of the basil plants, and this is actually a rate. So it's the rate, the height per day that the plants are growing. And then the yellow is actually showing the mass. So that would be the total weight of the basil plant and the mass that it's gaining per day for the yellow line. And what we see here is that that rate really increases, and it's at its highest at 35 days after germination. And you'll notice the steepest part of the curve, or where basil is really beginning to grow and producing most of its height and mass, is at that time between 23 and 35 days after germination. So what we think might be happening here is that as that basil is growing, it's producing all these new leaves. And so, as I told you earlier, sometimes plants make phenolics to fend off predators, right? So these plants can be, the phenolics can be bitter. So we think that basil might be increasing its phenolic levels while it's going through this period of rapid growth as a way to deter insects or other herbivores from eating those yummy, tender green leaves that it's growing during that part of its development. So one of the other things that we've looked at is the individual concentrations of both phenolic acids and anthocyanins. So one of the ways that we visualize the results for the individual concentrations of these compounds is using something which is known as hierarchical cluster analysis. So what the cluster analysis does is it groups these plant maturities based on similarities. And so if we start out looking here at the phenolic acids, we see the largest group in the phenolic acids is among these younger levels of maturity at 9, 16, and 23 days after germination. And the reason that those are grouped together is essentially at that point in basil's development, the plants all have low concentrations of the 6 phenolic acids that we had analyzed. And similarly, at 9 days after germination, so a little over a week into basil's development, it also has really low levels of anthocyanins as well. But something that's interesting is you'll notice that the 9 days after germination is its own group, and the 16 and, oops, I'm going the wrong way there. The 16 and 23 days after germination is in a different cluster. And that cluster is actually characterized by having moderate to high concentrations of these anthocyanins. And so what's actually happening here is we see that as basil begins to develop, so into 2 to 3 weeks into its development, it begins to put its resources into developing these purple pigments in the plant. So it hasn't gotten to the point where it's developing many phenolic acids yet, but it is beginning to kind of trade off and allocate resources towards making pigments. By the time we get to 35 days after germination, the plant is in its own cluster here because it's exhibiting high concentrations of all 6 of the phenolic acids, and it actually has high concentrations of all 4 of the anthocyanins. So that's that maximum point in growth where the basil is really producing a lot of phenolic compounds. But by the time we get to 49 days after germination, the picture gets a little more complicated. Some of the phenolic acids in basil kind of go away, and they show up in lower concentrations, while others remain in high concentrations. Some of the anthocyanins are beginning to decrease in concentration, so they're much lower, while some remain at moderate concentration. So, by the time we're at 49 days, about 7 weeks, we've kind of got a mixture of both high and low concentrations of the phenolic acids and the anthocyanins. So lastly, we see this more complicated picture actually shows up when we measure the antioxidant properties. So this is the antioxidant capacity as a function of plant development for the 3 basal cultivars. And so this antioxidant capacity assay actually tells us about the ability of our basil to scavenge free radicals. And so, what we'd expect is that when we see higher phenolic levels, we'd expect higher antioxidant scavenging. And when we have lower phenolic levels, we'd expect lower antioxidant capacity. Now, we see for the 9 days after germination that we do have the lowest levels of antioxidant capacity, and that's what we expected. However, we see that at 35 and 49 days after germination, essentially these antioxidant capacities are statistically equivalent, which was not something that we expected to see. We thought 35 days after germination would by far have the greatest antioxidant properties. And so we think this may be due to the fact that about 7 weeks into basil's development, it's still expressing high concentrations of certain phenolic compounds. And as it happens, the ones that it's still producing have some pretty good properties as far as scavenging free radicals. And so we think it's the high concentrations of a few of those phenolics that's leading to its ability to scavenge free radicals when it's at 49 days after germination. So, a few conclusions. We did find plant maturity affects the phenolic composition and antioxidant properties of basil, and depending on what stage of development you are at the, within the basil plant, certain trade-offs can exist on whether purple basil is either making anthocyanins or whether it's trying to make phenolic acids. So if you have purple basil in your own garden, you should not harvest it when it's too young because at about 9 days after germination, there's just not much there and it's not very purple anyway. So, but if you wait till about 5 weeks after germination, you're getting a lot of anthocyanins and phenolic acids for your gardening buck. So that's where you want to go for. So as far as acknowledgments, the funding for this work, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, Robert A. Welch Foundation, the Society for Analytical Chemists of Pittsburgh, and Southwestern University, the Herbert and Kate Dishman Endowment, as well as faculty student project funds. Our collaborators, Jenny Broadbell and Montana Quick, helped with the analysis of the antioxidant compounds, specifically anthocyanins. And then lots of student collaborators who have helped with this research over the years. So thank you.
So I'd like to invite both speakers to come up here. This is an opportunity for us to engage and hear the connections that you've noticed between these two presentations. But to be mindful of time, we're going to officially close this at 5 o'clock as we're supposed to, but I invite you, if you are able, to stay around informally for another, we'll just take 5 minutes before we then enjoy the reception that's outside. Both of these individuals will be available for questions. This is not the time for questions. This is a time to share some reactions and some connections that you see. But before we do that, I want to give, please join me in giving both these speakers our gratitude. Two beautiful talks. And if you need to leave for your next event, please feel free to do so. And so I will consider that we have officially ended on time. So now, with that out of the way, I'd like to take just a few minutes to engage with you and hear what you heard and the similarities or connections between two different research projects. So I'll ask for a volunteer. I've got pages of stuff here, but I want to hear yours. So who would like to start? Just raise your hand, and do we have a mic? We have microphones, actually, so just raise your hand, and I will bring over a microphone to you. Yes, Larry, can we get some? Thank you.
Okay, this has to do with maturity. You made a comment that the maturity of the plant impacts the antioxidant qualities, and I think about the emotional maturity of the hydras once they discover the circumstances that they're in, and how that might impact the quality of their life. And so I would love to hear, Elaine, you speak about kind of this emotional maturity.
Yeah, maturity is a great commonality. You'll hear her talk afterwards. I want to hear you guys. But that's a great connection. Maturity. Thank you. Thank you, Larry. Yes, Jim over here.
One connection I saw was how systems respond to what I would call divergent stimuli. Two different kinds of systems.
Thank you. Who else would like to share? Yeah, please, Ed. Right there.
Well, the thing that I picked up on was on the chemistry side, thinking about components in different contexts that represent potential and also risk, like the free radicals in the human body and in the plants. You know, these substances that may be produced for, you know, ambivalent sort of purposes in the plant's life. You know, the self-defense, different things to make the plant bitter, but then in another state, you know, it's very helpful to us. So risk and benefit, threat and benefit, and I think that in the social context, the hijras, you know, obviously threatening in their societal context, but also obviously a great benefit in the spiritual, in their significance there. And I think that there's a great deal of mystery, more mystery in the human side of this, but you know, they seem sort of like similar to me.
Thank you. Thank you. Mac.
A connection I saw, starting first with the hijra, the transgender persons, and I'm not sure if I want to use the word pure or concentrated, but through certain processes like the surgery, they're able to become more pure, more concentrated, more who they were. And then similar with the plants, through different processes, growth, namely that they become more pure in their phenolic compounds and things. So just two parallel processes, but completely different systems.
Thank you. Great. Who else would like to share? We have just a couple of minutes left before we go too far over. Oh, come on. Don't be intimidated by the people who already spoke. Thank you. Yeah, Sam. We'll get a microphone to Sammy up there.
One thing that dawned on me was that in both the Hydra's positions in life and women researchers and scientists, they both deal with stigmas that pose substantial barriers to success and their societal status. Thanks.
Thank you. Barriers. A last one that someone would like to? Yes, Mr. Joyner. Oh, okay.
I also wondered if there wasn't a commonality of the ability of plants and the community of hydras to create self-defenses that protected them from the threats, environmental or whatever. The plants, to the extent that they were using those compounds to ward off predators, and the community coming together to protect themselves.
The two speakers are going to be available at a reception that's right outside these doors. And so if you have questions, I urge you to find them and talk to them. And if you have more connections, please share them as well. But please, one last time, let's thank two amazing speakers. Thank you both.